No matter what edition of D&D y'all play, you or someone you know has suffered the indignity of a persuasion roll. A player has found themselves in need of a new ally or romantic partner in an NPC. If they're in town, well, town is supposed to be safe to conventional play. We know the shopkeep should give your players a discount, right? That barmaid should go out on a date with the barbarian. Dungeons are supposed to be hostile. The orc shouldn't help the wizard off the ledge. The troll should demand the fighter's gold. There may or may not be a die roll involved, but by and large, the ultimate decision is up to you, the dungeon master. And that's where it should be, right? Dungeon Master. Howdy folks, Gelatinous Rube here. We're returning to the most important D&D rules you missed. Last time we chatted about weight in gold pieces and its value to commerce, exploration, and crafting in all campaigns. Today we're talking reaction rolls, a replacement for intimidation, persuasion, and seducing to your heart's content, along with morale checks and loyalty. Today's rules are yet again very compatible with every single edition of D&D and its spin-offs, and I have no caveat. Every game is 100% improved by these mechanics. So let's give you all a brief idea of what these mechanics do, just to get everyone on the same page. When you encounter NPCs for the first time, or do a number on them in combat, or do something which could significantly change their disposition, you roll percentile dice. The results of this roll are totaled with situational modifiers, like whether someone's leader has gone unconscious, or whether your companions like you, or something as simple as what your charisma is. These modifiers change depending on what the reaction roll, or morale, or loyalty is rolled for. Now the results are totaled and compared against a list of potential reactions. Combat, retreat, passing one another by, enjoying a friendly meal, they're all on the table. Now we're going to lead off with how these mechanics actually work. First up is the idea of percentages. The reaction and morale rolls, along with the loyalty mechanic, all work off a percentile roll. There are a bunch of modifiers present which have a tendency to sometimes scare the OSR or even some new school players. Too many numbers on screen at any given one moment can ruin their minds, but it's okay, because not many of these modifiers change from moment to moment, and you're usually aware of which ones are changing. But as always, just like with the unarmed combat tables that we also did a video on, also working off a percentile roll, also have a bunch of unique, special, individual, and frankly small modifiers. Just roll the dice first. If you roll the dice first, you will be reasonably confident in whether it will miss the target DC, or hit the target DC, or be well above the target DC, and you sometimes might have to do a little extra work to figure out exactly what effect is going to happen. But by and large, if you roll the dice first, you will know the majority of what you need to know to begin with. Now, the biggest modifiers to the morale and reactions of other creatures comes from your charisma. Most base morale and loyalty sits at 50%, a 1 in 2 chance of failing. Charisma, though, can swing this wildly, because at a charisma of 3, the base loyalty sits at minus 30%, and the reaction adjustment sits at minus 25%. Now, no adjustments are made for a charisma score of 9 through 13, but both scores rapidly increase thereafter, setting at a plus 40% for base loyalty and a plus 35% for reaction adjustments. This is fairly important for certain character concepts. It means that paladins and druids in particular, I don't know if you all know this, but in AD&D you need I think it's a 15 charisma in order to be a druid, which is fascinating to me. I haven't seen this expressed in any of the later editions, or even implied that druids are particularly charismatic, but it does make sense It's just who they're targeting with their friendliness. It's not necessarily other humanoids, right? It's the creatures of the forest that they're being friendly to, which nowadays a lot of people actually abstract out into wisdom rather than charisma. Next up we have reaction rolls. Super simple mechanic. Reaction rolls are used to determine the hostilities of new encounters. If you come across an encounter, somebody has surprise, check to see whether somebody has surprise, whether somebody is parlaying. Gary actually gives us a note about not wanting or not letting players, discouraging players from attacking first and parlaying later. Generally speaking, you're supposed to parlay first. You are supposed to ask questions and shoot later, but you check for all those and then you check the reaction roll. On a result of, again, these are percentile dice, on a result of 5 or less, the encounter is violently hostile. They immediately attack. On a result of 6 through 25, they are hostile and take immediate action. This is an interesting difference from the prior result. My assumption is that your new enemies might be doing something like securing a door against your entry or loading a wagon with gold. This result seems to imply they pursue a specific goal which is hostile to you, or at the very least negative to you, which, if you're a good referee, is going to generate new ideas and new varieties of encounters almost on the fly. There's not just a bunch of orcs across whatever chasm you guys happen to find. There are a bunch of orcs, and there's a drawbridge across that chasm, which those orcs, given that they are hostile and taking immediate action, are now raising to bar your entry. On a result of 26 through 45, the encounter is uncertain but slightly based towards negative. So you roll again, you have a 55% chance of having a negative result. On a 46 through 55, the opposed are neutral, uninterested, or uncertain, which is interesting. I like the idea that people who don't feel any particular way about you, people who are attempting to not notice you, or don't notice you, or just a little confused about your presence, are all wrapped into the same result that would otherwise be, I think, boring. I think it's nice that they're all wrapped up into the same result, because they're still going to have some variety between those 3 encounter types. On a 56 through 75, uncertain but prone towards positive action. Just like 26 through 45, you're going to roll a D100 again, percentile dice again. You have a 55% chance of producing, this time, a positive encounter. On a result of 76 through 95, you get friendly with immediate action. Now, remember earlier, we speculated action implied these new creatures are in some way engaged in an activity when the players encounter them. But instead of hostile actions like locking all out, they could act in a protective capacity. The orcs are raising the drawbridge, but they lower it just enough for you to jump on, shouting to cross quickly. By the time your party crosses, you'll catch a glimpse of the behir or purple worm following close behind. And on a result of 96 to 100 or higher, because you can go higher through the use of modifiers, they are, according to the book, enthusiastically friendly. This is pretty cool. I just like the idea of, I've mentioned this elsewhere, I like the idea of walking into the dungeon, you see a bunch of orcs, and you see a troll together, and you get a high result, and it says they are enthusiastically friendly. So maybe they're sitting around a campfire, burning God knows what, burning a broken down door, because they don't have any real firewood left, and they invite you all over because they don't have enough food to go around, but maybe you do, and you get added to the pot, and they'll give you some treasure, or information, or maybe even join your party for a little while in return. You're not going to get to play there's no troll player race, but what this does is allows you to take advantage of controlling a troll. Now, reaction rolls, remember, are adjusted by the charisma of the character, but only one character, generally speaking. This has a hook into certain party dynamics, because whoever sits at the vanguard of your merry band is likely the person whose charisma is counted for initial reactions. Of course, sitting at the front of a party is, generally speaking, more dangerous. If your party face is squishy, they might not want to act as vanguard. But it's interesting to me, going back to an earlier point again, that certain character options, which are more restrictive, you're not guaranteed to have them in the party because the stat requirements for them are so high or so varied. Like the Druid or Paladin, which both require a high charisma to engage, are both pretty suitable for sitting in the front of a party. So your thief is probably not the best person to sit in the front of the party, even if they do have a high charisma. If they happen to take that position, that role in exploration of vanguard, they're probably going to. There's a risk there that they might die if you come across something that is negative. But occasionally, y'all will have access to a character like a druid or paladin, which is just tanky enough that you can comfortably sit them at the front of the party. So you have a interesting character dynamic of risk-reward, and occasionally, as the dice are prone to do, you just get a freebie, where you're allowed to have somebody, the party face, in the front of the party who is not inherently a dickhead, and probably not going to die. That brings us to morale. See, morale is a mechanic which forces troops, or monsters, to occasionally retreat, disengage, flee, or outright surrender in response to opposing forces. You know what, why don't I just have Carrie explain it to y'all? From page 106 of the Player's Handbook. Morale properly refers to the state of mind of troops during combat or stress situations. Stupid creatures tend to fight to the death, so do creatures with a set purpose in mind, like elites, guards, and fanatical creatures. Your character will never have to check morale status, nor will any other player character, for each player provides this personally. Some are brave, some are foolish, some are cautious, some are cowardly. Your character's henchmen will probably have to check morale, and so too will hirelings. Powerful monsters will never check morale, and even weak ones will probably not do so, as long as they have leadership. It goes on for like another 2 paragraphs, but Gary closes the section on morale as follows. If you treat your henchmen and hirelings fairly, pay them well, give them arms and equipment which allow them to effectively engage in combat by maximizing their protection and offensive potential, their morale base will be good. Furthermore, if you do not require them to take risks which your character does not take, if their mortality is not high, and their master does not abandon them to their fate as long as another course is possible, the troops will likely to be firm in the face of nearly any threat. Lack of action, setbacks, and similar things reduce morale. A good player pays strict attention to these considerations. This is fascinating to me because Gary mentions all the good things I normally hear DMs demand they get to roleplay out. Whether you put your hirelings in danger, the share of loot they receive, you get the idea. Gary is implying that these roleplay conceits have already been considered and accounted for in the rules. Pretty interesting as far as concepts go, but I wonder if Gary actually did it. Now y'all roll morale checks during a few different events, like if a leader is slain, flees, or goes unconscious, the party is at, or the opposed are at half or 25% dead, or even every single round if faced by an obviously superior force. Gary even gives us a guideline for obviously superior, like when one force is hitting twice as often as the other. That's a good rule of thumb. You can abstract other potential guidelines or triggers to this principle, like say, the other party is hitting twice as hard. If the morale check fails, the enemy responds depending on how badly they failed. On a result of 1 to 15%, it indicates a fighting retreat. 16 through 30% makes the enemy disengage. 31 through 50% indicates the enemy will flee in panic, and 51% or higher will make the enemy straight up surrender. This is fascinating because it leads into a rarely used mode of combat in conventional tabletop games, the chase. We'll discuss this benefit later, but think of the last time you didn't just run a team deathmatch style encounter. Any mechanic that makes combat more dynamic is a plus in my book. Now I'm including loyalty alongside the other morale and reaction roll mechanics. Reason being, this mechanic showcases how easy it is to build on the aforementioned to handle more complex social interactions. Loyalty works just like morale rolls, but the results can swing wildly based on how you've treated your companions. This is important because I've been told by some rather boring RPG varmints that reaction rolls and morale don't make sense, a well-fleshed out character can't be represented by a die roll. It's all boring. The section describing loyalty has modifiers for type and length of enlistment, training or status level, treasure received, discipline, racial preference, alignment, and a whole bunch of situational modifiers to represent a person in the context of working for adventurers. Now, there's actually too many modifiers to list out each individual table in full, but I have one more praise to give this rather lengthy section. I mean, as far as D&D goes, like, the whole fighter class is less than a page, but these modifiers take up a page and a half. My praise is that they're all organized to how likely they are to change, starting with how the companion knows you. Are they a slave? They probably hate your guts. Are they a henchman? They're slightly more likely to stick around. Fun fact, NPC friends of the party are actually slightly more likely to lose morale than your henchmen. Just meditate on the implications for a moment. Anyways, these are not likely to change during a campaign. If you bought your henchman or hireling as a slave, I don't know how that's going to change. But next up is status and training, which are pretty static across the course of a campaign, but they can feasibly shift. One of your henchmen could become a landed noble, such as a baron during the campaign. They could gain some training, but you will, in either case, know exactly when this change in their morale is applied, and in all likelihood, you were the source of this change. It was probably you that gave your henchmen some land and turned them into a baron. It was probably you that paid for their training. Now, the biggest benefit from using morale, reaction rolls, and loyalty in a campaign is by far fairness. A dungeon where every single NPC is hostile is worse qualitatively than a dungeon with occasional allies and neutral parties. If nothing else, it lets you all clear more rooms in a single session. But if we left this up to DM Fiat, probably all encounters would have an extreme bias, if not outright expectation of, that all encounters would be hostile. In fact, that is the status quo. This ain't up for debate, partner. Now, I thought long and hard on my use of the word fairness in this video and others. I'm worried people may take fairness to mean a state of equilibrium across individual encounters, and this is not the case. I evaluate equilibrium on the long haul. A group of 4 skeletons is probably an easy encounter in pretty much any edition of D&D, but it's just one encounter. Who knows if the rest of the day was easy? Can I call that encounter unfair? This fairness, this expectation can't be reliably handcrafted. It must be generated. You have to encounter maybe 4 skeletons in one room and maybe 20 in the next. The referee getting their dirty fingerprints on every encounter communicates to players that their success or failure was engineered by one person who does not share the same risks and rewards that they do. So to handle things fairly, it must be kept out of their hands to some degree. It must be abstracted, and the way we do that in most tabletop campaigns is with a die roll. Moving on, perhaps the coolest feature of these rules is the fact that they're a social mechanic. It's weird to think just how opposed the current D&D space is to social mechanics, both on the new and old school side of things, but social mechanics have been around since the beginning, partner, and these specific social mechanics put on display for all the world to see just how easy it is to represent NPCs with modifiers in a single die roll. Go back to the section on loyalty. It has modifiers for type and length of enlistment, training or status level, treasure received, discipline, racial preference, alignment, and a whole bunch of situational modifiers to represent a person. And the majority of these modifiers don't change all that often. Some of them might never change, just like a person. Rather than rely on a storyteller's whims and temptation to generate artificial drama, a simple list of modifiers pasted onto a single percentile chart really is sufficient to determine some of the most important actions an NPC will take, and to characterize them writ large. Now let's go over some objections, and I have to be honest with you, the objections that we discuss today are not going to be terribly high quality. They're not going to make a lot of sense to just about anybody, but we might as well engage them. So some folks don't like social mechanics to begin with. They think there's no value to a mode of play which can just be expressed by talking being handled with a die roll. Of course, this is pretty stupid. Mechanics exist. All mechanics exist because they produce a game and results individual experiences which are more varied, higher quality, and unambiguously fair compared to a storyteller's declarations. As mentioned earlier, the status quo of today's, reactions for NPCs are just default friendly when in town or default neutral, and when in adventuring locations, they are default hostile. This sucks. You have a literal status quo in a game which is not supposed to have a status quo necessarily on experiences. It's supposed to have variety. The status quo is supposed to live in the mechanics where players can reliably expect a certain range of experiences. New and old school players alike took out the range of experiences and while taking out the mechanics along with it, and instead just gave you a status quo that produced one kind of experience per domain, you could say. Some folks don't like the concept of helpful NPCs in the dungeon in general. This might be why. The unambiguous status quo of hostile critters is considered a good thing. Dungeons are supposed to be deadly, orcs are supposed to be evil, and deadly evil things are not supposed to offer you any kind of advantage. I used to type back and forth with these people at length, but now I have a considerably simpler response. I am playing this game for experiences which books, movies, and video games can't or will not provide me with. If you're here to play a worse version of all three, go somewhere else. You do not belong in tabletop RPGs. Now, some folks claim that they actually don't mind reaction rolls in general. They only really care about role-playing specific, important NPCs to their exact qualifications. They argue if they spend a lot of time studying an NPC they invented from whole cloth, I don't know how you do that, but they assure me this is a thing, they should be permitted to determine the exact reaction of the NPC, and this bugs me for two reasons. First, the DM in question pretty clearly has a specific reaction in mind already, and this is bad, this is unfair. This hypothetical RPG varmint is writing themselves a blank check to write specific outcomes into the story rather than inserting NPCs into a campaign whenever they feel like it, using a homebrew NPC as the excuse to do this. A truly fleshed out NPC is not going to align with the DM's desires versus or for the party at all given times, which is why we have reaction rolls to begin with. They're not wholly aligned with the one person who is playing all of the antagonists of a given scenario. The character is not aware of how many times the players have succeeded or failed in recent sessions, recent days. It doesn't influence their perception on the world, at least not for a fully fleshed out NPC. And this turns every random encounter with orcs more fleshed out and variable in the trend of conscious persons than the DM's OC donut steal. And if the DM truly wanted to produce an NPC that was sufficiently fleshed out to act on their own supposed wills and desires, using the DM as a referee as a vessel, the DM would not do away with reaction rolls. Instead, maintaining the experience of tabletop RPGs, the DM would simply produce a unique reaction chart for that NPC's use. This is how you could tell the RPG varmint are away from a particularly creative or zany referee. Fleshing out an NPC means having a variety of accessible emotions and responses to external stimuli. It is diametrically opposed to following the whims of a single person playing all the antagonists of a given game. The other reason this bugs me is the idea that encounters are just kind of throwaways to begin with. They're not supposed to produce campaign-changing events, but anyone who's run a game lasting longer than 6 sessions knows the players are happy to change trajectory, invent new solutions to their problems, and produce wildly different campaigns off as little as a single item or ally. The idea that you have special encounters whose outcomes must be protected is quite frankly ridiculous. At best, these encounters are dissonant with the rest of the game, small islands of referee fanfiction designed as roadblocks to a better experience, but at worst, it's indicative of a wider trend towards not permitting players to experience the exciting, potentially campaign-upending encounters that should be hiding around every corner as intended.
Thanks again, folks. Thanks to Blue Dot Sessions. Thanks to Mariana for the art. I got it. My voice was shot while recording this. I was way too congested. But hopefully this Monday's video is going to be, well, I know that this Monday's video is not going to suffer the same fate. Peace.